Hirohito, right? I would know, and this was a question we put on a test, I think is one, I think we ended up dropping the question or whatever, but I would know that even though they have an emperor, they still are primarily militarized, right? So the general or whatever would have more power than the emperor, essentially. Does that make sense?
Is he a figurehead?
What's that?
Let's see.
Pretty much at that point, yeah. I mean, you've got that little spark of the Meiji Restoration, late 1800s, you know what I mean? So the emperor is restored, you still have a little bit of political power or whatever, but that's, I would say, argue more cultural than anything. But yeah, so militarized would then put you more important. What will happen, and the Italians are going to be involved a little bit longer in this war than they were in World War I, right before they drop out. I want to say it's 43, I believe. What will happen? Besides D-Day, the U.S. and other powers will fight in North Africa, and then they will make their way into Italy, right, and then eventually start. So when I say making their way to Berlin, they're coming from like kind of the northwest or whatever with France across, or from England across, and then they're coming also up from the southern part, right, to try to catch up through Italy or whatever to go up. What will happen post-World War II is, even before the war's over, you have the Tehran Conference and the Yalta conferences where they start to figure out what's going to happen to Europe and Germany or whatever after the war is over, because they knew the war is coming to an end. The decision to be made, let's talk about Germany first. What do they do with Germany?
They like sector partition it.
So they split it into two sides, east and west. The east will be controlled by the Soviets. The west, you'll have the British, the French, and the Americans, I think, primarily, right, in the different sections of. And then they have to figure out what they're going to do with the capital part, because the capital part of this becomes important. They split it again, right? So even though Berlin falls primarily in Eastern Europe, they also split it again, right? And then that gives you a democratic West Berlin in a communist East Germany, right? Which becomes interesting for a while. That's the Soviets putting the flag, I believe, over the Reichstag, which is like the governmental building or whatever, like our Capitol building within Berlin. So that shows that. And they've got all kinds of different pictures of these. There's your two different bombs. Again, what that does for the United States to exalt itself as a world power is very important. What are you doing? You're good. You're Disney Plus now. Okay, so you can play some games. But you got to turn the volume down. We'll get into the Cold War. One other thing, which is a part of this in Unit 7, was mass atrocities. Obviously, the Holocaust begins in the early 90s. Like, as soon as Hitler takes over, essentially, they start to alienate the Jews. I know, at least in my class, we looked at some of the Nuremberg laws, right? And they talked about identifying how a person was considered to be Jewish, kind of laid out the restrictions of what they could and could not do. That's the beginning part, right? Then they begin to round them up within Germany and put them in concentration camps. As the empire of the Germans is expanding eastward, they also start to set up concentration/death camps, right? Because most of these end up not great for the people in there. Then they start to add those. I don't know that you need to know every concentration camp. I mean, obviously there's Auschwitz, which is a very famous one to know. Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, I believe those are both in Germany. Treblinka, I think, puts you into Ukraine, I think. So you start, that might be Poland too. Anyway, so you start to make your way eastward. And then the Germans are trying to expand to, and then they will also run into a problem with trying to attack Russia, right? The same way that Napoleon will have the problem. Now, they were a little bit more successful during World War I, but World War II, they're not as much. Now, other mass atrocities. In the 30s, after, or before the war begins, but at the same time, Stalin is really rising, right? Stalin starts to take over, I think, in like 1925. Lenin dies in like 22 or 23, a little bit after establishing the Soviet Union, and then there's a little bit of internal struggle going on, and then Stalin will take over a couple years after that. He will rule until 56 or something like that as well, right? We looked at that when he dies paranoid alone, which is very fitting for Stalin, I imagine. What was the Holodomor, do you remember? An intentional famine of the Ukrainian farmers, right? The kulaks or whatever, right? So he gave them that. The Armenian genocide during World War I, right? You'll see the Ottoman Empire going into basically what was Christianized areas, right? In you know, mass killings of Armenians. The Cambodian genocide, any names to know with that? Pol Pot. We talked about this the other day in class, and I don't know, it was really more in my 7th period, but remember how, like, even when you guys were reading with chapter 29, right, the intellectual hatred that Mao has for intelligent people, why is that? Why don't, and I brought this up with Pol Pot, because Pol Pot does the same thing. Why don't you want an intelligent populace.
Because you don't want to get like.
You don't want to be questioned. You don't want people to bring up things that happened in the past. You know what I mean? You want people to do what you say to do. And Pol Pot's going to try to pull that card as well. He's going to have intellectuals. And this is my favorite part about which is odd to say about the Cambodian genocide. But what were some ways in order to indicate intelligence? Glasses. So glasses, people were taken from the urban areas, right? They were then taken to the rural areas to basically step back in time to be agriculturalists. It is not going to work. There is a paranoia that goes around Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge would be the group that's basically facilitating this whole genocide. And there are tens of thousands of people in Cambodia today that are just missing. You can go to what they call the killing fields, where they just had mass graves of tens of thousands of people, and you can still see maybe pieces of bone or a shirt or something like that hanging up, and they're not able to identify all of the different body parts or whatever, right? So that's part of it. And then the Rwandan genocide, which I know jumps us a little bit more, but what is one of the direct causes of the Rwandan genocide?
Two rival groups.
It's two rival groups, but why is there such a rival? Now, I'm not saying it didn't exist pre what I'm talking about, but why does it continue on afterwards?
Wasn't like a majority.
So when the Europeans, the Belgians, the Germans, whatever, show up in that region, they are going to start pitting these. And this is a great example of ethnic problems that will exist within Africa post-decolonization as well, right? Which you guys also just read about. Even on your test, right, it was ethno-linguistic, right? So it talked about the different ethnicities or language barriers, right, associated with Africa, and then it showed you the political map of Africa. Was it the same?
No.
Africa is a very diverse place. It's a very diverse place as far as language and culture and everything else associated. So you now take these political entities, political boundaries, and you just put people together and you're like, hey, get along. And it doesn't always work out. And in 1994, you've got the Hutu majority and the Tutsi minority, and the Hutus who feel like they've been persecuted for so long, and the Hutu president dies, so an extremist group known as the Interahamwe is going to issue out an attack on the Tutsis. And for about the next 3 or 4 months in 1994, they tried to round up and kill as many Tutsis and Tutsi sympathizers, which would also put you into Hutus as well, killed. Reports I've seen anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million, 800,000 I think was referenced on one of the PowerPoints or whatever. Within the span of 3 or 4 months in 1994, that's how many people are killed throughout Rwanda. Did you have a question?
Were Tutsis the majority? Were the
I thought, and again, feel free to clarify, I thought the Tutsis were the minority that were put in power over the Hutu. Now, after the decolonization happens, the Hutu are then going to be kind of more in power because of the populace, but there's still resentment on Tutsis, right?
Okay.
And the attempt in the Rwandan genocide is to eliminate them as a group of people, right? Hence the definition of genocide. All right, so let's get into decolonization a little bit. So 45 to 91 is the Soviet Union versus the United States. That would be your Cold War time period. On the Cold War stuff, focus on decades if you need to. I mean, there's so much stuff to be able to bring up. You'll never be asked all of it, but there's different categories to look at different time periods. So again, space race, arms race, those would be easy ones to break this down into. That breaks not only advancements in technology, but it also brings the relations part, right? Which would then lead us to proxy wars, which would be another topic that you'd want to bring up. So let's run through as best we can. So we looked at the Yalta Conference allowing Eastern European countries for self-determination. Does that happen?
No.
No. Why does it not happen?
Soviet Union.
There's a couple reasons though. I think a lot of people would say Soviet Union just because that's an easy enough reference, right? Because they start to get these Eastern Bloc countries and stuff. But don't also forget that the United States is going to proactively start getting military alliances throughout Europe, which is in turn going to cause the Soviets to want to do the same, right? So what is your alliances in Europe? NATO, right? And again, not just in Europe, right? But Turkey, you looked at in Greece, your chapter brought those two up, which are more outliers out of Western Europe, right? I know those aren't in Western Europe, but primarily when you think of NATO, you're talking about the British, the French, right? Greece and Turkey will be important as well. And then you have the Warsaw Pact, which is essentially your Soviets and then your Eastern Bloc, right? So it's the economic and the military rivalries or alliances that start to pop up. How does the United States show its superpowerness after World War II? What? The atomic bomb, right? But that would be during the war, so how do they do it after? What?
Hydrogen bomb.
Hydrogen bomb eventually, so that goes to the advancements in technology. What about the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan? that also shows that we are economically stable or superior, whatever terms you want to use, right? Remember, the Truman Doctrine said, if you resist communism, we will help you. The Marshall Plan said, this is how we will help you, right? And millions or billions or whatever is going to be funneled into places. I say funneled, like it's some kind of, anyway. You've got England getting quite a bit, France will get quite a bit, but also Turkey and Greece get quite a bit as well, right? So that goes to your NATO countries, like they're laundering money. Anyway, another outcome would be newly independent states. That's your self-determination part of this. What happens with Palestine?
Israel population is what it is after.
Remember post-World War I, and this is something to remember, what was the Ottoman Empire would have been primarily in places like the Middle East, right? Which then gets turned over to places like, or with countries like the British and the French primarily, right? And that's, we talked about Iraq a little bit, you get into Syria, Egypt, right? We looked at the decolonization in Egypt in 56, or I guess it's in 51, right? And then it's 56 with the Suez Canal. Maybe it's 53 and then 56. Anyway, the Balfour Declaration supported a Zionist view that there should be a formation, a homeland for the Jews, which will eventually become Israel in 1948. Due to World War II, you have a large exodus of Jews to Palestine, which is why that's some of it. Now, again, you agree with it, don't agree with it, or I mean, any of that, with everything going on with Palestine and Israel today, I'm not gonna, I mean, you guys form whatever opinions you want on that, but that's what happens, right? That's how you get the formation of Israel, because you have Western powers. It's UN mandated or sanctioned, right? So it's not as if the British were the only ones. The United Nations said, yes, we'll do this, and then you get into the formations or the partition, right, of Israel, yes.
When's the Balfour Declaration signed?
I want to say it's in 48. I'd have to look up the exact date, because what I'm a little fuzzy on is there's a declaration of in support of, right? But then I think it's an actual UN mandate that has it. Does that make sense? So I feel like the Balfour Declaration is more like of a suggestion to be pushed, and then they have to solidify it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
But I'd have to clarify that as well. So Israel, proxy wars. What are some proxy wars you should know? And if you go in order, right, just to clarify for you, 50 to 53, you've got Korea. Remember, Korea split north and south. Why? Because the Japanese had control of it. When the Japanese unconditionally surrender after the second atomic bomb is dropped, then Korea will be split north and south, which is then communist versus not, right? 50-53, the Korean War. In 1950, the North Koreans, even though they basically established the demilitarized zone and the separation of, the North Koreans will surprise attack the South. They will be able to push them down almost to the very tip of the Korean peninsula. And then the United States and others will get involved and help push them back. As we push the North Koreans back past the DMZ and close to the border of China, who gets involved? China jumps across the border of North Korea and China, which is the Yalu River. They attack the United States. There are some, like MacArthur, I believe, that argue that we should go ahead and handle China now and not worry about this later. Why does China get involved? So they had just recently fought the communism, right? That put you in 1949. They were also bordering onto, and they didn't know what would happen next if the United States and their coalition of forces were to then take all of Korea, right? Maybe get rid of communism there, then China might be next on that list as well. So that would be something. Then we get into Vietnam. You guys just recently looked at in your chapters how in 54, at the end of the French Indochina War, right? You see the French leaving. You start to see the push for independent nations. Due to containment, the policy of containing the spread of communism, and due to the domino theory that we thought if one country fell in Southeast Asia, the rest would fall like dominoes to communism, we decided to get involved. We don't officially get involved in a war until 64 with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So from about 54 until about 63, what are we doing? Our best to mess up South Vietnam with the establishment of no Diem, right? And we talked about Diem literally the other day in class. He is gonna be ousted, even though he was backed in place by the United States, he's gonna become ousted in a military coup backed by the United States in 1963. The war will begin in the long run, and not to just sum up the Vietnam War like it's no big deal. In the long run, the United States pulls out troops, I think by 73 into 74, and then in 75, the North Vietnamese army will take the South and take Saigon, which will eventually be named Ho Chi Minh. You guys just read more about Ho Chi Minh. Some people viewed him as a nationalist, some people viewed him as a communist. Do you see how they blurred together though in the chapter, right? Like at some points they called the Viet Cong a communist group, but then the Vietnam was also kind of associated with the nationalist group, which aligned themselves with them. Does that make sense? So now you have nationalists / communists. I know that Ho Chi Minh is not overly well liked in some circles, but he was a nationalist because he was trying to reunify Vietnam and not have it split. Does that make sense? What is another proxy war you should know?
Afghanistan.
Where?
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, right? So 79 to 89, the Soviets will come and try to occupy Afghanistan because there's reports of an anti-Soviet or anti-communist movement happening, right? So they go in, they try to take control of the Afghans. The Afghans, with the help of the United States, are able to fight back against the Soviets, and the Mujahideen is able to eventually get the Soviets to leave. What is so important about Afghanistan, in my mind, is the retreat that happens in the late 1980s is going to be foreshadowing for the further collapse of the Soviet Union, right? That's an example of them not being able to win a war. They also would have had a problem with like Poland looking for independence in the late 1980s, right? Czechoslovakia pushes for independence. So all these Western Bloc or Eastern Bloc countries start to break away in the late 1980s as well. Let's talk about Cuba for a second. In 1959, Fidel Castro will overthrow Batista, who was also a dictator, right, and not a very nice person. And then he will try to usher in communism into Cuba. Because he's aligned with the Soviets also start to do what in Cuba? Put missiles in missile silos, right, which would then have access through ICBMs, which would put us into our arms race, right, would improve the ability of them to shoot nuclear warheads at the United States. That leads us to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if I'm not mistaken, the Bay of Pigs is in 61. I think the Cuban Missile Crisis is in 63. Is it 63 or 62? Let's see if we have any more of that in here, because I think I put some of that in here. Germany after World War II, we talked about West Germany, Berlin. Sorry, I need to remember to click just instead of just talking about things. There's your containment. There's a little bit of Chinese propaganda for you. McCarthyism, what was McCarthyism?
It's communist witchcraft, because McCarthy says there's communists in there.
Part of the Cold War is the Red Scare, right? This overwhelming paranoia feeling in the United States. Part of that would lead us to the Red Scare. McCarthyism. Joseph McCarthy basically says he knows all these communists in the State Department. He starts to hunt these people down like a witch hunt publicly. They form the House Committee of Un-American Activities. They broadcast this stuff on the radio and on television. These innocent, well, I say innocent, I don't know if they're communists or not, but they get brought in before Congress and basically, interrogated about their political leanings and all of that. Most of the time, not much proof was associated with that, but it was an easy way to blacklist people and basically ruin careers and further stoke that paranoia that existed. And I put 50 to 54. I think by 54 or so, they kind of move away from the open hearings and things like that. What else? Korea, we looked at Vietnam, Soviet, Afghan. Who's that guy on the bottom right there? Bin Laden was a member of the Mujahideen who proactively fought against the Soviets in 1970s and 1980s, which they also benefited from U.S. weapons and U.S. training, right? Now fast forward a couple years and you get to the rise of Al-Qaeda, and then you get to the invasion of Afghanistan in 2002, in which the Taliban and Al-Qaeda will use the training and the weapons provided by the United States to fight against the United States as we occupy Afghanistan for like 20 years. Al-Qaeda, this was brought up the other day by somebody. What is Al-Qaeda? And we'll try to talk more about this because I know we're getting into globalization. That'll be a part of it. We'll talk next week or just to clarify. But what is it? It's an international terrorist organization made up of multiple parts, right? Under which will be aligned when eventually Al-Qaeda, which was stationed in, I think, the Sudan until the late 1990s, because of too much pressure by the United States, Bin Laden, who is like the leader of, is going to flee to where? Afghanistan, right? That's one of the reasons why we invade Afghanistan, is because we think that's where Bin Laden is post 9/11. Once he leaves Sudan, they go to Afghanistan, and that's when you start to get the planning for 9/11 and all the other stuff. But he gets initial training and becomes almost like a national hero throughout Afghanistan. I saw something around 9/11 every year. They always have documentaries on or whatever. One of them talked about how in like the early 1990s, one of the most popular names in the Arab world was Osama, in response to Bin Laden being one of the Mujahideen members to help stop the encroaching Western world into Afghanistan. So he's a localized hero within that region. Espionage, we talked a little bit about. You brought up the hydrogen bomb earlier, so that goes to your arms race as well. What that is on the bottom left, I believe, is a U-2 spy plane, and it's hard to see, but they would have been affixed with like a large telescopic or a large camera basically on the bottom, so they could take spy pictures. One of them will be shot down, I think it's 1961, and a pilot by the name of Gary Powers will basically be imprisoned in the Soviet Union, and we do eventually a prisoner swap, right, for a Soviet spy or whatever to get Gary Powers back. So that all goes towards the espionage part or whatever too. Those two people on the bottom right are the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel. Julius worked at one of the plants or whatever that had access to the hydrogen bomb or had access to classified materials. He is accused of spreading those materials, and by default, because his wife, I guess, is married to him, she also gets convicted of espionage. They're put to death. And if I'm not mistaken, it takes 2 goes on the electric chair to kill Ethel. Oh, poor Ethel. I think Julius goes quicker than that. Bay of Pigs, right, when we tried to kill Castro, which is an embarrassment, in 61. Cuban Missile Crisis in 62, so there we go. 63 is when Kennedy dies. Maybe that's why I thought that was that date. Does anybody know when Kennedy dies, besides 1963? It's like November 22nd, 1963, right? Cold War in the 70s and 80s, we looked at this. What's in the back of Reagan? Does anybody know? Star Wars, right? Remember we talked briefly about putting satellites into orbit so they could shoot down missiles, and conveniently we called it Star Wars because that was cool at the time. I'm not an expert on Star Wars, neither the movies and or the defense system, but from what I understand, it was not overly successful, and it cost billions of dollars or whatever, right, to even attempt to do this in the 1980s. What's going on in the picture on the bottom left? Tiananmen Square. So in 1989, I don't remember the exact month, in 1989 you will have student protests, right, because of the confinements of the communist government in China. They meet in Tiananmen Square, which is why it's called that. A lot of it are student protests. These students are gonna be killed, right? I think upwards of hundreds of them will be eventually killed. There's a guy by the name of Tank Man, which you see in the bottom left there, who is from what I understand, I tried to look this up the other day, from what I understand, still anonymous, goes out with like grocery bags or whatever, like he was out for a little errand, steps in front of these tanks and they try to go around him. He keeps going back and forth. There's some interchange of dialogue between him and the people driving the tank or whatever. And then from what I understand, he kind of just leaves. But it's symbolic, is like resistance to the Chinese communist stuff. This is one of the first times with the advancement of technology that they were able to get some of these images out, right, and into the rest of the world, which is kind of how we know more about it. This will happen again, not Tank Man, but again in 2009, right? The Chinese government will forcibly put down people protesting or whatever, a lot of college students and stuff like that protesting the government. And this is where I told you in like, I think it was 2009, they shut the internet down. Why would you shut the internet down? So there's no evidence to be passed along to the rest of the world, right, about what happens. The fall of communism in Europe, this gives you dates on there. We talk about Poland, Czechoslovakia. In 89, the wall will fall, right? They will eventually, so the wall will fall. People start jumping over the wall, right? And then eventually they start to piece it apart or whatever, like take hammers to it. But when was the wall built, do you remember? 61, I think. What is 61, 61, 64, something like that? Socialism in Latin America. You've got Juan Perón, which I should have moved those over because you've got Allende there, that's Perón and them in the middle, even though it says Pinochet, and then you've got Perón, or then you got Pinochet on the right. Remember that Allende was a socialist leader that was then forcibly overthrown with the help of the United States in order to usher in Pinochet. We watched a video, I don't know if you guys talked much about Pinochet in Chef's class. Augusto Pinochet was a dictator. Any political rivals that he had, and we watched the one about being brought up into helicopters and just thrown out into the ocean. People were disappeared if they opposed Pinochet. And then he ends up being exiled for a while. He then becomes like senator for life. And then eventually he's, I think, arrested and is able to live out the rest of his days by like the 1990s. There was a place called Colonial Dignidad, and I think it's in Chile or whatever, but it's basically a hospital that was run by an ex-Nazi doctor that Pinochet would send people to be tortured. That's how terrible of an individual that he was. And we looked at a little bit about thousands of people dying. He basically ruins the economy, is very much a strict dictator. Colonial affiliations before, so this is a map just to give you a reference to where they were. Why does World War II become the catalyst for decolonization? Part of it is it's a hassle to maintain a population that you have to control forcibly with military presence, right? That would be part of it. The second part is that some of them are becoming less wealthy because they're also having to pay for the rebuilding of Europe, right? The same conversation we had post-World War I, that'll happen again post-World War II. There's also moral issues here. All right, we're gonna take a potty break real quick. Give me 2 minutes. This way, bud, this way, this way.